We are at a Bitcoin cryptocurrency conference at the happiest place on earth. Coins in the Kingdom, how are you doing? So I've been in Bitcoin since end of 2010, first part of 2011. I trolled for a long time. I didn't really get involved in the scene. I just kind of held back, held some Bitcoins. I believed in it, but never really felt the need to get involved into it. I didn't really start getting involved in Bitcoin activism and the gospel of Bitcoin and doing Sean's Outpost until first part of 2013. So I'm going on 2 years of sort of being out here. And I've given a lot of speeches. I've given a lot of intros. And you do a lot of stuff. And it's a rare thing where you get to introduce two of your heroes in the entire cryptocurrency space. And that's what I get to do right now, because I'm going to introduce Mr. JefferyTucker and Andreas Antonopoulos. Now, I met Jeffrey for the very first time at his cryptocurrency conference, which was exactly 1 year ago today. And I had read his books, so I knew sort of where his philosophy was. And I also remember when Jeffrey was dismissive of Bitcoin. And you know, we all make, everyone in here, shut up. You were all dismissive at Bitcoin at one time, and you were a liar if you weren't. The first time someone told you about Bitcoin, you're like, Ponzi scheme. Yeah. But I remember, like, as my first interaction with Jeffrey at a cocktail party thrown by BitPay, I said, you know, Jeffrey, when I heard you start speaking about how you were now passionate about Bitcoin, I said, you know what, this is a moment. A person that understands Austrian economics and understands the fight for liberty so much, gets it, and is going to go and take this mantle on. This is a clear moment that we are really on to something special. And it meant a lot to me. And the very first conversation I ever had with Jeffrey was that, because it is. It's really important. And we thank you so much for having you as part of the movement. And it's fantastic. Give Jeffrey a round of applause. Not that you're not going to do it anyway. So I'm sort of a passionate guy. Like I cry at Disney movies and things like that. So it doesn't take a whole lot to get me worked up. But the speeches that Andreas Antonopoulos gives about the future that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies can bring, and the things that Bitcoin will bring to the world, they make my hair stand on end. Almost every time he talks. And there's other people in the space that do that, but I think very few that are as humble and as down to earth and really, really care about taking care of all of the world's issues first. You know, you've never heard Andreas stand up and be like, it's going to be fantastic. You guys are going to be able to shop on Amazon with Bitcoin, and we're all going to be able to, like, eBay's going to, like, there's never been an Andreas Antonopoulos speech that's like that. He is very diligent about what we have called now on our project that we need to get back to work on, which is the other 6 billion. That Bitcoin is going to bring good for the people that aren't in America, that aren't for first world, the people that really don't have access to financial products, that they really do live under extreme oppression financially from their governments, from the world that they live in, and they haven't been able to see anything else. It's really just been a darkness, and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and the blockchain technology is really bringing light to these people. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my good friends, JefferyTucker and Andreas Antonopoulos.
Thank you. So I think what we've decided to do is that Andreas and I will just kind of give a few introductory remarks and then kind of open it up for the panel. But I must say that I'm so excited to be here. I mean, do you know this is the first time I've been to Disney World? And yeah, and isn't it just so? No, it's just, look, it's wonderful because this, you know, I'm so inspired by Walt Disney in so many ways. I mean, you know, he created something that didn't exist, and now we all take it for granted. Like, yeah, Disney World, who cares about a bunch of rides or whatever, you know, movies or whatever. Look, before this great man came to the world and exercised his remarkable imagination and put things together, the world was a very different place. He changed it in his lifetime and for all future generations. That's a remarkable kind of thing to consider, you know, that a mind can make a new world, you know, can generate something through hard work, imagination, speculative capital, through I don't know, just a vision, just like a driving, crazy passion, something he saw in his head that he had to work to make happen, and he did. And of course he did it with so many others, and it created this massive, beautiful empire entirely based on really cool things like private property, commerce, you know, free enterprise, entrepreneurship, all the things I truly love. All the cool stuff that makes the world bright and beautiful and happy. So I'm really happy to be here for that reason. Just driving in, I got the chills, you know. So yeah, and I love it. And I love how the legacy has continued. In many ways, that's what we're all about too. You know, we're about creating this new world. I think this new world is going to emerge in any case. We've got the technology in place. You know, we've got the blockchain, we've got the distributed network. These things are the greatest innovations in history, so far as I'm concerned. Speaking as you know, a technology maven and a lover of human liberty and, well, a not-so-secret anarchist. These kinds of technologies excite me very much because for the first time in history, we really have all the tools we need, finally, at long last, to defeat the despots of the world for the first time really ever. I mean, it's really kind of depressing when you look back at history and see that every kind of cool innovation that private enterprise comes up with, like there's always some assholes that steal it from us and use it against us, you know? I'm sorry, am I allowed to use that kind of language at Disney World? Okay. I felt a little uncomfortable as I said it. You know, you get that feeling, you know? I'm sorry about that. I'm gonna clean up my language from here on. I'm usually not a potty mouth, but I get whipped up and terrible things start to happen. But we now have, I mean, like a technology that can't actually be taken from us. I mean, they did it with everything else, fire and you know, fire and internal combustion and flight and guns and, you know, every cool thing that private enterprise ever invented and made wonderful. There's always some despot out there that grabs it and uses it against us. It's one of the worst aspects of prosperity. That it's never just prosperity for you and me and all normal people. It's also prosperity for them, the parasites and the despots and the people who just want to see the world burn, you know, as they said in Batman. So that's the worst aspect of prosperity in a way, and it's really regrettable. It's actually terrible. You know, actually, it's very interesting. Mises discusses this point in his brilliant and mostly unread book called Nation, State, and Economy in 1919. And he's writing right after World War I. And he says, for God's sake, what the hell happened? We had 50 years of the greatest stage of innovation ever in the history of the world. All this brilliant new stuff coming out, just this cornucopia of new products and innovations pouring out from private enterprise. And then this ghastly thing happened. These megalomaniacs, these looters and parasites with legal privileges started this world war and used all these brilliant innovations against the very forces that led rise to them. And he said, this is a terrible, terrible problem. So long as states exist, they're always going to steal stuff and use it against us. So what's the choice we face? Mises asked this question, what's our choice? He says, our choice is to deny the states things like, you know, instruments of mass destruction by being desperately poor ourselves. And he said that doesn't seem like a very good option, really, to Mises. I don't like desperate poverty. I don't like the state of nature. But the problem is, so long as we're constantly striving out of that state of nature, then there's always going to be states around to grab the great products of private enterprise and use it against us. So what's the solution? Mises' solution is we have to stop the tyranny. We have to find some mechanism to make this possible, to limit power, or else we're all going to burn. It's going to be terrible. So his solution is interesting. This is 1919. And he says, what if we really take this idea of self-determination seriously? Do you know this term, self-determination? Do you know it? It's kind of old-fashioned in a way. It was a very, Woodrow Wilson used it all the time. And he used it as a way of arguing against monarchy and the large empires of Europe. The self-determination of peoples and nations. And to him, that meant, like, let's blow everybody up. You know, that's not what Mises meant by it. He said self-determination is ultimately, if you're going to take it seriously, and if you're going to take democracy seriously, it has to be about the individual. Like, we have to reduce this principle of self-determination down to its individual essence. And if we can ever do that, that's going to be the final protection of humanity against tyranny. And he says, let's start with nations. And within those nations, let's let ever more smaller groups secede and form their own nations, all the way down to the smallest unit. And Mises says, if it could be technologically possible, ideally, we'd reduce this principle of self-determination all the way down to the individual level. This is 1919, right? So he's like dreaming. You know, what if it were possible to do this? He doesn't think it would be, but he imagines a possibility that someday it might be possible. My friends, welcome to 2014. It's possible. It's possible now. We're seeing it happen. Peer-to-peer relationships developing all over the world, and so many fascinating and surprising ways, from transportation to hotel rentals to buying and selling of everything on a geographically non-contiguous basis, all the way to the money itself, the greatest surprise and innovation of my lifetime. I never thought I would live to see a day where the answer would be presented before my eyes. And as Jason mentioned, when it first came to me, you know, I didn't see it. It seemed mysterious and crazy and a little bit nutty and seemed actually too good to be true. I thought, God, these crazy computer geeks, they don't understand really anything about reality. I guess they think they can invent anything through computer code. Well, you can, I guess. That's essentially what happened. And so over the last 2 years, it's been something of like an intellectual upheaval for me to see what was there and to understand what was already presented before me and to kind of tease out the implications of this in my mind. And we should not underestimate them. In 1977, the Nobel Prize-winning economist F.A. Hayek writes an article in the Wall Street Journal. And now this is a guy who'd been studying the subject of money his entire life with grave frustration, because early in his life he's like telling central bankers they shouldn't do this because that's going to cause a terrible war. You shouldn't do that because that could cause a terrible inflation. And you shouldn't do that either because that could create, you know, a terrible depression and a massive cultural calamity. But it turns out he had a hard time getting states to listen to him because the central bankers in the states actually quite like the things that they do. So after he got the Nobel Prize, a very nice thing happened to him. He didn't give a damn anymore. And he felt like he could say whatever he wanted. We should all get the Nobel Prize. So we can just say whatever we want. But Hayek got to say whatever he wanted. And in this is a very interesting article, actually. 1977, he writes this amazing piece. And he says, look, I've been at this my whole life, and I'm quite frankly a little bit pissed off. And And I really don't think there's any hope for any reform whatsoever from the top down. It's just not going to happen. He said, and yet, if you look back over the last 100 years, and look, this is an exact quote from the article. He says, central banking and the nationalization of money is wholly responsible for war and the growth of tyranny in the world. That's his, I mean, this is Hayek. He's a careful scholar. He was careful with his words. He said it's wholly responsible for war and the growth of tyranny in the world. Now, it's true that wars existed before central banking, but not total war, not war on you and me, not massive global war where there's no innocence, where everybody is fodder, everybody could be drafted, anybody could be killed, everybody's a militant, everybody's subject to being wiped out by the state. Such a thing did not exist before the age of central banking. He's right about that. And as for tyranny, you know, there have been a lot of very bad things that have happened in the world, in the history of the world, but nothing on the scale as what happened in the 20th century. It's just ghastly beyond belief. Weapons of mass destruction, gulags, gas chambers, you name it. It's just been a terrible, terrible time. Hayek said it's all caused, of all things, by nationalization of money and central banking, because that's what gave the despots of the world a blank check. They had to get the resources from somewhere. So if you give them the legal right to invent these resources out of thin air, terrible things are going to happen. So what was the solution? He says, it's a very interesting thing. He says, look, if I were the head of some big bank thing, Citibank, whatever, he said, I would put out, first of all, he says, we've got to get rid of legal tender laws. All right, that's just like, if we can get rid of that, we'll reform the money ourselves. Private banks should start issuing their own currency, based and backed by their own assets, and start selling these on the market as alternatives to nationalized money. This is his kind of proposal. And he says there will be many different competing currencies and probably one would emerge. And he has a kind of an explanation of this. It's speculative, I'm not even sure it's right, but he was basically on the right track. And the right track means we're going to have to reform the system ourselves. We can't depend on the politicians to do it for us entirely. If we're going to see reform, it has to come from the bottom up through innovative, speculative entrepreneurship. And he was way ahead of his time. This is 1977. He was the only person saying anything crazy like this. It had to wait until 2009 to happen, but it finally did happen. Another subject that's very interesting to me, and well, let me just say this. With Bitcoin, we're seeing things we never thought we'd see before, right? Surprises that are emerging before our eyes that nobody ever expected to happen. And why is that? It's because when things are nationalized, they're essentially distorted. They're taken out of the realm of social reality and put into this kind of static, weird world where there's no innovation, no responsiveness to the human community, no real advance. Everything gets kind of worse and worse and worse so long as things are nationalized and taken over by a junta and frozen in place. That's what happened to money 100 years ago, and that's why it's so crappy today. But there are other institutions that are in a similar situation. And it was only a few days ago, actually, when I began to think about this completely. As you may or may not know, I get to officiate a wedding tomorrow between David and Joyce. Yeah, on the blockchain. Yeah, so, I mean, that's really cool that you're here for this, because look what's happening. I mean, think about the implications of this. About the time central banking came along, you know what else came along? Marriage licenses, right? Marriage was a little bit nationalized, to use the term. I don't mean federalized. I mean nationalized in the sense of taken over. In order to enter into this thing, you had to go through the state, and then the state manages it for you. How well has that worked out, actually? Not very well, I would say. Not well at all. In fact, the origin of marriage licenses was essentially had to do with, this may surprise you, the desire to exterminate people. That was the goal. It wasn't to marry people, it was to exterminate people. It was all bound up with the eugenics project. The undesirables would be wiped out in 1 generation. They wouldn't have to use gas chambers and gulags. All they'd have to do is prevent people from procreating. And the best way to do that, according to these idiots, was to prevent them from marrying. That was the whole basis of the marriage licenses, you know? This is bad stuff, actually. But it's persisted all these years, and now we have all that you expect to come out of a nationalized, frozen, static world manufactured by this junta with illegitimate power. We have people turning against each other with endless debates about who can get married, under what conditions. We have a culturally divisive political debate about gay marriage, gay adoptions, anybody who finds themselves in a marriage that they want to get out of, ends up being looted. Everybody's, there's bitterness all around and sadness. Nothing has turned out well. And so it makes you wonder, what would have happened had the state not been involved? It had remained a purely peer-to-peer relationship. I don't know the answer to that, really. But I think we may be on the verge of an innovation in which we're going to discover what that is. And that innovation occurs at this conference starting tomorrow morning with a marriage contracted on this beautiful, beautiful thing called the blockchain. This, my friends, is the beginning of the denationalization of marriage. Yeah. So thank you for joining me in this. And I think Andreas and I are going to have a wonderful discussion about the implications of this and so much else. He's a good friend and a good colleague, so I'd like to welcome him up here. Thank you so much. So I'll give you this. If you want to try to do this, go ahead. And we've also got this microphone here, and I can just sit up here. Go ahead.
Sure. So everyone who's here today, I wanted to address an elephant in the room. 330. $330. How does everybody feel about that? So I'd like to talk about that just a tiny bit and talk about innovation as we look at it historically and in retrospect, because it's much easier in retrospect than it is in prospect. I had a party in November of 2013 in my house, California, for Bitcoin 250. A party. Invited about 60 or 70 people. And we scheduled that party for Bitcoin 250 and ended up having the party for Bitcoin 450 because a lot of things happened in the 4 weeks when I delayed the party slightly. But here's the interesting thing. At the time, Bitcoin was amazing at 100, and it was really amazing at 250. And right now, if Bitcoin was at 250, I'd be probably holding a wake, not a party. At least that's how most of us would feel, right? But it's the exact same price. What has changed is the direction we're coming at it. And so it's sometimes tempting to feel that something's going wrong here. And I made a tweet about this the other day, and I said something that a lot of people found ironic and perhaps self-interested. But I said that Bitcoin has never been stronger. And you might think that's contradicted by the market dynamics. But in my mind, that's a fact. Where we are today in October of 2014 versus a year ago, if you told me a year ago that PayPal would be taking Bitcoin, I would have said you're crazy. That's not going to happen for at least 3 or 4 more years. If you told me a year ago that there would be 200 to 300 startups that have received angel funding and first-round funding in Bitcoin space, creating thousands of jobs, I would have thought you were crazy. So today we look at an environment that is generating its own economic activity. And if for a moment you ignore the price of Bitcoin and you look at Bitcoin as an industry, if it was any industry other than the one threatening the banks, there'd be a weekly special on CNBC about how amazing this industry is because it actually has jobs and growth in it. If we were making yachts, it would be the miracle of the yacht industry because no other industry is currently creating jobs except for fracking. And fracking is a fucking crime against nature. And what we're doing is actually creative. Bitcoin is a booming industry right now. We just had our second major jobs fair in New York after the first jobs fair we did in Sunnyvale during the summer. And for most people who graduated after 2008, they've never heard of a jobs fair. A jobs fair is where companies get together because they're looking for employees. Imagine that, right? We are 6 years after the Great Recession, and the economy is like Weekend with Bernie. The Fed is holding Bernie's arm up and going, look, he's alive. He's dead. The economy is a zombie right now. And anybody who's part of the middle class, anybody who's not involved in the profitable industries of fracking and bombing, knows that. Anybody who's gone to a supermarket knows that the inflation rate is not 2%. That the unemployment rate is not 6%. Those numbers are ridiculous lies, and we all know it, right? The inflation rate is 2% if you exclude food, energy, and healthcare. Well, fuck, sorry for eating. Education is turning into a giant bubble. Healthcare is a giant bubble already. And yet, supposedly, we're back where we were in 2008. But we're not really, right? The slowest recovery ever, and it's not really recovered, not for anyone. And we're right on the precipice of two major events. Next month, the Fed is stopping the taper. You know what the taper is? That's the gradual decline in quantitative easing that has pumped $1 trillion a year into the economy, directly into the main banks, mainlining them like cocaine for the last 6 years, which they have turned around and created bubble after bubble after bubble until the only asset that is generating returns is cash. And everything else has turned into giant toxic slag heaps of uneconomic productivity, or unproductive economics, sorry. So the taper is ending next month. And we're still doing austerity, we're still doing massive deficits at the same time, which is kind of weird. And the economy is nowhere. So we're in a situation where things are very dire. They're no better in Europe, they're no better in China. And amongst all of this, Bitcoin is creating jobs. So in any other context we'd be celebrating, but right now the price is kind of depressing, especially if you entered Bitcoin in the last year. Or worse, if you made the mistake of using Bitcoin as a speculative investment, you're probably hurting right now. I know a lot of people are. So I want to talk very briefly about innovation in retrospect. When we look at the history of innovation, that history is whitewashed. It's simplified, it's summarized in a nice rosy picture of success where all of the bad things are completely ignored. So open a textbook, look at a documentary, look at the history of the automobile, look at the history of electricity, look at the history of the internet. And what do you see? Heroes of industry come forward with a great new innovation. The world welcomes them with open arms, celebrates them, raises them up to new heights, and we all continue with this wonderful new invention. And that history is bullcrap, because that's not what actually happened. And if you go back and see what actually happened, here's what actually happened. When the first automobile came out, people had horses. And the automobile was not an improvement over a horse. There were no roads. There was no infrastructure. You couldn't get gasoline anywhere. The only people involved in automobiles were these weirdos who were portrayed by the media as effete, rich elitists who had time on their hands to play around with these disgustingly smelly, dangerous machines that had no practical purpose. And they were made fun of. Because you couldn't get anywhere with a car because there were no roads, and it would break down every 2 miles, and it was horribly inefficient, and it was dangerous. So what did the media do? They wrote about these infernal machines that would certainly kill you if they came to your town. And based on these media reports, the British in 1896 passed the Red Flag Act. The Red Flag Act required that any one of these new automobiles was operated by a crew of 3, a pilot, an engineer, and a flagman. The pilot and engineer had to manage the machine so it didn't explode and kill everyone around it, while the flagman had to run ahead of the car, 100 yards ahead of it, waving a red flag to warn pedestrians that one of these infernal death machines was coming their way. This, of course, effectively slowed cars down to the speed of a running pedestrian, thereby ensuring that Britain lost the race to develop an automotive industry, and the US won. When electricity was first popularized, Edison and Tesla went at war against each other, abusing the patent and copyright systems to try to destroy each other's industry. They went as far as executing an elephant to show the dangers of AC power, or rather of DC power. Edison did that. Meanwhile, what did the media do? They wrote about the fact that the Paris exhibition would have been the last time we ever saw electricity used, because once the Paris exhibition was taken down, the world would return to the reliable source of heat and energy, paraffin. They said that only effete, elitist, rich people would spend the money to electrify their homes, which involved ripping out the walls and putting wires in them. And the sole purpose of putting these wires in the walls would be to surely burn your house down. And then they proceeded to run article after article about every house that burned down because of an accident with electricity, whether it really was an accident of electricity or not. Horrible stories of people being electrocuted. That was the media perception. That was how they addressed this. They didn't go out and say, Edison, this is the most amazing thing you've given humanity. It will change the world forever. We will change our sleeping habits, our manufacturing habits. It will lead a new wave of industrialization. You will bring millions out of poverty. No, they said, you crazy kook, you're going to burn all our houses down. So, welcome. We're all crazy. We look at Bitcoin and we don't see a weird, crazy Ponzi scheme. We see possibility. We see vision. We see something that can improve the lives of potentially billions of people. Maybe not Bitcoin itself, but certainly the blockchain technology. We see the possibility of moving away from the state because we don't think the state adds anything to currency. It only destroys things with currency. And so, be comfortable in that position. Be comfortable in the position of the ridiculed, of the outsider, of the weirdo, of the tinkerer, who sees in technology that which others do not see. Because in the end, history vindicates the people who take a chance, who make a leap of faith, and decide that a technology or an innovation is in fact world-changing. And let them laugh at you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. You know, it's funny. I feel like I've kind of been around for this whole digital revolution in a way. In the very early part of it, I had a friend of mine try to call me up and sell email to me. He said, you really should get email. And, no matter how much he talked, I couldn't see it. I thought, this is absurd. Why not just make a phone call? Why not just, call up somebody, tell them that I'm about to call you on the modem, and sync up your modem and then transmit your information. This is this unreliable system where you send some message out to some box in some unknown place, and they later pick it up. It just struck me as ridiculous, especially since nobody else would actually have one of these boxes. So I was rejecting email in the early days, and it took, especially he told me that it would actually cost something. I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Nobody would ever pay for such a downgrade from our present technology. And then I remember after the World Wide Web was invented, this would have been 1995 was the first, I think, web browser, and the privatization of the internet. We began to see these enterprises coming along, such as Amazon.com. And I remember reading an article by David Broder in the Washington Post where he was making fun of this. He said, this is never going to work as an enterprise. It'll never take off. There's no chance. Because anything they do right, some other guy could just come up with Amazon1.com and reproduce his results exactly and outcompete him immediately. So won't be any such thing as success in online commerce. It just it cannot exist just by the nature of the thing. And you know what? Most people agreed with that. I remember this very well. And then, of course, there's Wikipedia, right? Do you remember? It wasn't too many years ago when everybody made fun of it and thought it was the most absurd idea, ever. Well, you know what? When Bitcoin came along, I had about this time gotten sort of fed up with all these debunkers. Like, everybody's been wrong for like 25 years now, So why don't we start actually believing in the visionaries for once? And then, of course, there's that great moment in 2000 with the dot-com bubble and bust, which seemed to confirm all of the biases of the Luddites and the debunkers. And they lived off of it for something like 10 years, despite the fact that within a few years, they were all proven completely wrong, that was, yes, it was a bubble and a bust. But if you had believed that and stayed out, then you would have missed the most gigantic, epic, world-changing event in human history. So at some point, you began to believe in the power of innovation. And when I first discovered Bitcoin, and I began to understand the logic of it, which was not easy, actually, in the early part of 2013, at least not for me. It took me several weeks of hardcore study before I finally got convinced. You realize that Bitcoin is very much like all these other technologies. It's amazing, it's wonderful, it's innovative, it's ground up, it's organic to the social order, and everybody's skeptical of it because it's new and because it's different. And when I put that together, that was when things changed for me completely. So thank you very much for your remarks, Andreas.
But at least it can't burn your house down.
Yeah, that's right.
Because then it would be as bad as electricity.
It's
Who
actually
needs
interesting.
that?
Have you been over to Newport, Rhode Island? Have you ever been there?
Yep.
Yeah. The old mansions of the Gilded Age tycoons. Many of them early adopters of electricity.
Right.
And they were all, their neighbors were terrified. And it was a very scary thing.
Yeah, there's something fantastic about how history is whitewashed, in that that's not the story you're taught in school. You're not taught that every single person who did anything important in the history of technology was ridiculed, ostracized, considered crazy, called names, and excluded from their own scientific community. Whether it was Einstein or Stephen Hawking more recently, or Tesla or Edison or the Wright brothers. In 1903, the New York Times wrote that perhaps through application of mathematicians and mechanicians, human flight will be possible within 5 to 10 million years. They were only off by 4,997 years.
Well, let me ask you, Andreas, what kind of things have you faced? First of all, when did you get involved in Bitcoin? And what kinds of things have you faced? You've been a leading voice in this sector for much longer than I have, and much more leading than I have been. So I wonder if you could tell some stories.
Well, I think it's important to realize that, as Jason said, everyone at first is a skeptic. The first time I heard about Bitcoin was in mid-2011, and my initial reaction was absolutely typical of everyone else I know in Bitcoin. It was, nerd money, that's never going to work. And so I completely ignored it. And I continued to ignore it for about 6 months, and then the beginning of 2012, I heard about it again, and this time I decided to read the Satoshi Nakamoto paper. And I read the Satoshi Nakamoto paper, and I went, oh, it's not money, it's a network. Holy shit, this is huge. And I understood that this is, the thing is not the money, it's not the coin. There is no coin, it's the blockchain, it's the consensus mechanism, it's decentralized agreement over distance, over an untrusted medium. That, to me, all of those things clicked. I was in networks before, distributed systems and security. It was like, wow, Byzantine general's problem, this solves it. This is unprecedented. This has never happened before. It's huge. And it has so many applications in so many different places. And so then I started. I still didn't think it was going to work. I thought it was brilliant, but I didn't actually think it was going to work. And I'm not convinced it's going to work, right? It's not like, someone asked me today, someone asked me yesterday, well, why can't the banks just accept it or something like that? I'm like, you're expecting people who have $10 trillion invested in not accepting it to accept it. They're going to be like, oh, well, it was a fun industry while we had it. Let's all go home and not get bonuses next year. I'm sure the spouse is going to love that news. Of course they're not going to accept it, right? We're working at the moment on a technology that fundamentally offends and disrupts the interests of some enormous players. So it might not work. Bitcoin might not work. The blockchain is going to work. There's no question in my mind that cryptocurrencies based on blockchain will be here 15 or 20 years ago. One of the thought experiments I have is 30, 40 years from now, there's an economics student. And as their first year of economics, the professor asked them to write a paper on historical currency systems. And they need to write a paper explaining how central banks work. Because by that time, all currency systems are based on blockchains. And just like, students in history today have to write about the founding fathers and understand how they thought and what their motivations were and why they wore those funny wigs. And so students like, this is irrelevant, it's stupid, I'm never going to use it in my job. Why aren't we learning consensus mechanisms and proof of stake? That's much more interesting. Why do I have to write about these crazy people back in the 21st century? And they're desperately trying to understand how any civilization would be stupid enough to invest the power to control the entire economy in 12 people who were not elected. It's insane, right? And if you look back at that and say, well, you can do it with mathematics, or you can just give 12 random dudes the right to do it without asking anybody else. And what we'll do is we'll sit around on our televisions with our button on the trade engine, our hand over the trade engine, and we'll wait. And if Yellen says cautiously optimistic, and the intonation on cautiously sounds more optimistic than if she says somewhat optimistic, we're going to buy $600 billion of treasuries. And that's how it works. I was actually in a trading room back in the 90s when they were watching the exchequer of the British Exchange, who is like the Federal Reserve central banker in Britain. During the time when there was a currency crisis in Britain, they were waiting on TV. And they actually had an expert who was like a psychologist, and his job was to decide if the news was optimistic before the exchequer said the first word in the conference. So based on body language and posture as they walked up to the microphone, the expert, who was observing very carefully, would go, all right, so this meant buy, and this meant sell. And there were hundreds of traders in the room who, based on that reading of the tea leaves, would understand whether the exchequer had read the other tea leaves well enough to make a decision. So I rambled a bit on that one, but economics, like imagine in 40 years trying to explain this to a student. Like, so that's how we ran currencies then. that makes no sense.
I've often, it's not a coincidence, is it, that the Genesis block comes out in early 2009, right at the tail end of this potentially calamitous, sort of financial crisis all over the world. I mean, there had to be something of a motivation there. Like, the circumstances gave rise to the creativity at some level, don't you think? Or do you think it was already, even regardless of the 2008 financial crisis, that we would have seen Bitcoin emerge?
I don't think. I think for many people, Bitcoin emerges as if miraculously, suddenly in 2008. But it's not like that. If you look back at the cypherpunk mailing lists, this stuff was going on since the mid-'80s. Yeah.
It was just a matter of solving the
from David Chalm
problems,
and DigiCash and through all of the developments. Basically, the moment Diffie-Hellman and Rivers Shamir-Edelman invented asymmetric cryptography, almost immediately a movement was started to say, how can we use this to make unforgeable digital currency? And then it was just, well, let's try this. Well, that didn't work. And let's try this. Well, that's centralized, so they shut down the servers, so that didn't work. And it kept going like that until in 2009, Nakamoto was like, well, how about this? And of course, and here's the other whitewashing we do. Satoshi Nakamoto announced this on the cypherpunk mailing list, right? Do you think everyone went, oh, that's it? He has the answer. We've solved it. Okay, everybody go home. No, they all went, no, well, that's not going to work.